Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. And to some people, good very early morning, as in Gifford there. So I don't know what's the time there, 5 or 4 or so. All right. So it's really, really great to have you in this workshop. And I think we start right away. I'm really, really happy to have in this workshop together with you, Peter Rosman. As you've seen in the first video lecture, the main ideator after this course, the person that has actually made possible that we have all these video lectures. So Peter has been a former campaigns director with the IUF, International Union of Food Workers, and it's much longer name with tobacco and restaurants and so on, but perhaps Peter wants to say that himself. But we are going to start straight with the first question, and then give Peter the possibility to respond to that question, a question which is related to his video lecture. And then after that, we would open up for questions. I take it that we have all watched the video lecture. As we've tried to reiterate, it's really, really important that we engage with the instructors in a way that allows us to have more meaningful conversation only if we have already watched the video lecture. So I take it that's the case. Yes, bonjour Mathilde. Peter, a few months back in early this year, we were at a conference of the labor process theory, and somebody made a question, raised a question about labor in the South, the question of labor in the South, and claiming that perhaps we don't need to talk anymore about workplace demands because workers are making other sorts of claims more about civil rights, and that perhaps trade unions and labor organizations are not anymore the organization we should be looking for transformations in the society. So what would be your response to that after having worked in the labor movement for all your life? So over to you.
Well, my quick and easy response would be that in the first place, workplaces certainly haven't disappeared. In the North as in the South, people are still working. I don't think that we live in a quote unquote post-industrial society. Quite the contrary. On the other hand, it is certainly true that in much of the global South, a large number of people in many countries, even the vast majority, are not employed in a specific workplace. They work in what's sometimes euphemistically called the informal economy, engaged in many, many kinds of labor. And it is also certainly true that in those countries, strong union movements have been built at various times, but they've been largely absent from the concerns and the struggles of those people working well outside that framework in which they organize, bargain, and negotiate. The other thing I would say is that and I think this comes through very strongly in the case studies in this chapter and elsewhere in the course. It's a real mistake to separate so-called workplace demands from other demands for including civil rights, because at various times and in various places, unions have been central to fights for civil rights, for democracy, for the construction of systems of social support extending well beyond a narrow group of workers with some kind of collective bargaining position vis-a-vis employers. So the question of how and why workers have organized for many, many things. If you look at the history of what working people have done over the past 150 or 200 years, there's an enormous scope of organizing which extends well beyond narrow workplace demands and into many other realms.
Thanks very much, Peter. Do we have any immediate question to Peter? Anyone that would like to raise any question? Perhaps, Peter, we give people a bit of time to warm up also. One of the... Oh, Nico, yes, please.
Well, good morning from Buenos Aires. Can you hear me well, Peter? Okay. Well, thank you, and hello, everyone. I do have a very specific question, and I'm happy you touched the issue of the Global South. I'm based in Argentina, but do have, and we frequently discuss this at the GLUE level, the relation between the South and the North, and whether we should dismantle that because of also the migration and transmigrational processes, etc., etc. But I wanted to raise a question, and it's pretty much a debate, because you said that the issue of transcending particular identities, which captures very much my attention. My question is, especially in countries that went through process of colonization, there's an increasing debate on how race deals with class. And in my reading and in my experience, sometimes at the union level, and this is the case of Argentina, it's hard to deal about race issues because class seems to be more important. So it's pretty much a theoretical question, but also a practical question, how to deal with this in order to accommodate class, not below, but definitely not above, but neither below. And the question is, what do you think about the processes and the debates behind intersectionality? Are they useful at the union level? Are they too complex? And how to deal with particular identities? The problem of, what the left has mostly said is that dealing with particular identities fragments the struggle, which is correct. But again, race is important in countries or in areas that have been colonized. And in some perspective, even as important as class. So the question again is, how to deal with intersectionality, which has become pretty much a fashionable term, and how to deal seriously with intersectionality. What's your comment, and whether we need to transcend particular identities or actually integrate them into class debate? Thank you, and sorry for the long question.
No, and it's a very good question, well, it's a big question. First of all, I think the question of race in modern societies, both in the North and the South, is very much linked to the whole process of capitalist development. And what we know now, largely due to struggles, rather than academic or theoretical reflection, is the extent to which classes are gendered and racialized, and the impossibility of separating the two. So I think that the question as you pose it is essentially one of integration. That it would be absolutely absurd to deny that workers experience oppression as people of color, as women, as members of various communities. It's a fact, and it's deeply embedded in every aspect of our societies, North and South. The question is, what happens when particular identities push out a sense of a larger class identity, and what that means for the development of a working class politics? I think that the politics of the labor movement are a politics of class because they originate specifically in capitalist exploitation, and therefore class is paramount. But at the same time, you cannot insist on class to the exclusion of everything else, because then you ignore very real forms of oppression and very real forms of identity. And I think the trick is always to maintain that unifying class perspective while fully integrating the specific demands of working people who are oppressed in a variety of ways beyond a narrow definition of class. Class is always constructed through gender, through race, through ethnicity, through religion. There's so many factors that constitute identity and are so deeply embedded in our societies. But the problem is that I don't think you can get a truly liberating politics if you think of it as the sum total of particular forms of oppression. There has to be something, there has to be a more transcendent goal which unites all of those. And in my view, that is class. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thanks very much.
Obviously, it's a debate, but thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I mean, just to reiterate what Peter was saying, we knew that the question of class and class formation would come up, perhaps from the very first conversation, and we worked, of course, with the strong belief in mind that class has never been homogeneous, and that all these different identities that make up us even as human beings are intertwined into the class struggle. But there has been also clearly a concern with us not to break the class ceiling. So we're not very concerned about women CEOs that can't make it to the top. Our concern is really with the working class women and men and their struggles for emancipation. But yes, any other question, whether related to this or something else in the video of Peter? Is there someone? I didn't see a hand. Yes, Fish. Yes, please. And Gifford, did you want to say something? Did you want to have a question too? Okay, we come later.
I want to follow this conversation on the race issue.
Fish, can you please introduce yourself, please?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, but if you can introduce yourself, because I think it's important to do that.
Okay. This is Fish. I'm a union organizer for domestic workers. Currently working for the International Domestic Workers Federation as the regional coordinator for Asia. Yeah, nice to see you. Nice to see Peter again. Yeah, and of course, Adira again. Yeah, so I'd like to follow up this issue about the race. So our friend Nicholas mentioned that the union in Argentina, although I am not sure about the context of Argentina, but I can really see there is, in general, overwhelming, more far-right racism, popularism among many countries, and also it can also be happening in the unions. Because we do organizing of domestic workers that includes many migrant domestic workers and many domestic workers who are ethnic minority, tribals, or lower class or caste. So what we can see, the rise of the far right and the racist development can also stem from a European centralized description on, like, we have many migrants, we have many refugees. Now they are like kind of invading the country, Germany, etc. So the race issue that we are facing may stem from the European centralized description on the far right development that may have impact on the global south. I'm not sure. I'm just thinking about maybe this can be a situation that is happening that makes the unions more hesitate to talk about race than other things. And for the rest, I agree with Peter, because being a union organizer for domestic workers, we never just focus on one issue. The intersectionalities term is new, but for us, it's never new. Thank you.
Peter, would you like to comment on that? Although I think Fish had more of a comment, right, if I understood correctly, but would you want to have any reflection on that?
Well, there's a couple of things I can say. One is that the construction of racialized migrant workforces is not limited to the North. If you look, for example, look at the Gulf states. That's one of the major centers of racialized and ethnicized migrant labor. So it's by no means a northern phenomenon, and in fact, that's probably the most extreme form where the indigenous population forms a world apart from the millions and millions of migrants working both in areas like construction, but also as domestic workers. So you have probably the most extreme example of a labor market which is segmented by race and by gender, and the answer is and so, well, there's many things I could say about it. As you know, the IUF was quite important in supporting both home-based workers and domestic workers. So that is an example of a trade union lending its support for a broad-based struggle for rights, including the rights of migrants. Second, I think one of the things that is feeding the rise of this authoritarian, racist, xenophobic, in parts fascist right wing is an acceptance of labor market fragmentation and segmentation according to nationality, according to race, according to gender, where migrant workers are not treated as part of a working class, but as an invasive species. And, there's no way of understanding the situation of migrant workers in the North or the South unless they're considered as part of a truly global working class. I mean, a third of all Mexican wage earners are working in the United States. So you either consider them part of a working class, which has to be organized as workers, but which also has special requirements because of the massive injustice of the whole immigration regime, or you succumb to this ambient racism, which is a dead end for workers and for our societies in general. I think that's the choice. You certainly cannot exclude class.
Thanks, Peter. And Fish, we are going to have a separate chapter on migration, really taking up the question of how labor has responded historically to the question of migration, including tensions and contradictions into that response. And we'll have the possibility to perhaps engage even more in depth with that. So we will continue this discussion. I know Gifford raised his hand earlier, and to Comrade Isis, if you can write a question in Spanish, I saw that Nico put in the chat that he can translate. So please do, if you have a specific question. We understand the situation of workers in Peru and particularly unions being severe. But if you want to say something more specific, do write in the chat in Spanish. And Gifford, over to you.
Hi, I'm Gifford. I'm a GLU tutor and trainer in San Francisco in the US. And I want to just ask Peter, the topic of the course is the lessons that labor history offers to organizing. And I'd always like to know, like, what are the high points you've seen? Do you have any inspirational examples looking back at history that can inform our struggles today? And as Nico introduced this topic of racialized labor and gendered labor and all that. And I think often victories overcome some of the divisions. Do you have any positive examples you could offer us today that have inspired you?
Well, many things inspire me, so it's a large question. I think a couple of things really emerge from the case studies in this chapter, which range pretty far and pretty wide, both in time and geographically. One is that, essentially, we've been living decades of labor movement defeat. Labor movements are weak, they're fragmented, they've lost their force. That's true virtually everywhere, north and south. And I think that with that increasing, the legacy of, labor movements in most parts of the world, with a very few exceptions, have basically been managing defeat. And what has happened is that their level of political imagination and political ambition has shrunk. So when we talk about organizing today, it's basically limited to fighting for union recognition, to collective bargaining fights. And I think if you look at the case studies and what inspires me, what you see is this enormous scope of working class organizing, since the appearance of industrial capitalism. Workers have organized for civil rights, for the right to vote, for the right to participate in a variety of ways in their societies, to democratize education, to build systems of social support. They've been engaged on a huge range of issues that concern working women and men, as well as our societies more generally. And you see that in all the case studies in the chapter. You see that very clearly with the Chartists, for example, who organized in a variety of ways, all of which were, by the way, illegal at the time. You see it in the struggles of the agricultural workers in Italy, where they developed important forms of rural and urban solidarity, rural and urban workers acting together through the rather unique institutions that they built. I think you see it with the rise of industrial unionism in the United States in the 1930s, where some of the unions took head-on problems of working class fragmentation by race, by gender, by ethnicity, by religion, and built powerful unions that also engaged in other struggles outside the workplace. That comes through very clearly in our presentation on the CIO Meatpackers, which became a very strong force in the civil rights movement, because they'd spent many tough years fighting racial discrimination on the job. You see it in the rise of the so-called new unionism in Brazil, which integrated the demands of not only this new class of industrial workers that had emerged from this high-powered industrialization campaign pursued by the military dictatorship, but it includes resurgent rural trade unionism, movements of urban shantytown dwellers, Afro-Brazilians. All of them converged into an impressively strong movement against the military dictatorship and basically for more participation, for more democracy, for more justice, for more equality in this hugely unequal society that was Brazil. So that impresses me enormously. We tend to look at the world today and the world of work through the eyes of this really shrunken labor movement, and we ignore these huge, really broad mobilizations in the past, many of which were successful. I think that's what's inspiring from these stories.
Thanks a lot, Peter. We won't have a workshop on Chartism, unfortunately, but you know so much about Chartism, and I think perhaps it speaks a bit also to the question of Isis, if I understand correctly, about worker repression in Peru, where people are basically discussing their lives, and the fact that the word repression is being used in different contexts. Sometimes even losing your job is considered repression, or forms of intimidation is considered repression. And Chartism is really interesting exactly because, as you mentioned a bit earlier, we're talking about illegal activities, basically. So if you could, perhaps, what do we learn from Chartism that could somehow inspire struggles today of workers that are fighting and unorganized labor that is fighting repression?
Well, I think the point about Chartism really is that, when we think about the Industrial Revolution, which is what produced Chartism, the emergence of industrial capitalism and specific forms of wage labor, we tend to think of big factories, right? Big textile factories, belching smoke, coal mines, so on and so forth. But the England of the 1830s and 40s that produced Chartism was a very diverse sort of productive landscape. There were, to be sure, enormous factories springing up. Mining, on the other hand, was largely artisanal. There were hundreds and hundreds of small mines scattered all across the country. And many people worked at home. The remnants of what was called the domestic system, which is an early form of capitalist production, which is essentially organized by merchant capitalists to employ people working in very small workshops, in many cases in their homes, by furnishing them the materials and then buying the products at a set price. And those people were being badly squeezed by the emergence of more efficient forms of factory production, and were in quite a desperate situation, but they formed an important part of the support for the Chartist movement. The Chartist movement also drew on the labor of skilled artisans who were extremely numerous and whose position was being undermined by the spread first of this kind of merchant capitalism in the domestic system, and then by the factory system. And then there were the factory workers, people working 15, 16 hours a day, massive amounts of child labor and female labor who were paid less than the price of the men who were employed full-time, because it was considered that they weren't really permanent members of the workforce. They were somehow ancillary. And in an environment where workers had been promised political reform because a rising class of industrial capitalists were demanding a bigger role in parliamentary governments, a number of laws were passed which were experienced as harshly punitive by all working people. Laws forbidding, of course, workers from organizing any sort of trade union. Laws forbidding assemblies of more than 50 people in any one place. Laws restricting the suffrage, which had been expanded, but which still only included some 600,000 people, wealthy capitalists, merchants, landlords. laws which made it nearly impossible for anyone other than the very wealthy to publish. There was a tax on publications, which people of modest means couldn't meet. And so all of this flowed into a demand for political reform. Chartism was a movement which demanded equal suffrage for every male, not yet universal suffrage for men and women, but the right of all men to vote. And allied with that was an increasingly militant trade union movement, which pursued through which workers pursued their individual demands, their individual disputes with employers, but where workers made it very clear, for example, in a series of mass strikes and general strikes in 1842, that they were striking for the charter. They wanted shorter hours, they wanted higher wages, but above all, they wanted the right to vote. And that was Chartism. The other interesting thing about Chartism is that often when we speak about British colonialism, we're looking at the overseas colonies. Ireland was a colony, and the Irish had been dispossessed. Massive numbers of Irish were seeking work in Britain because there was no work at home. And the Chartists supported home rule and even independence for Ireland, and even expressed opposition to British colonialism in India. So you can see there is an incipient anti-colonialism, which is very much a part of the Chartist movement. Many of its most prominent leaders were Irish.
Thanks a lot, Peter, for expanding a bit more on Chartism. Any other question or comment? And please, you can also put it in the chat box if you have problems with, either the language or with the connection.
I wanted to ask something.
Of course.
There's no one else. In the text and in the video class, and here you mentioned that it was the moment in which capitalism changed from pre-industrial to industrial relations when the unions were born. And I mean, there's a lot of discussion if we are changing this stage of capitalism now or not. And I mean, I had a discussion recently with a guy that says that unions should now stop discussing the 8-hour journey and discuss other things on how to value the work of workers. That's something innovative I have never heard before. But which things, we're in a labor history course, so I am thinking, which things do you see are similar to that moment now, and which you see are not the same as this change of stage in the capitalist system? I don't know if I was clear.
Yes, that's clear. I think, again, the situation today globally is not that different from what I described in looking at the Chartists almost 200 years ago, where you have a variety of forms of production more or less coexisting. It's not as if there's been a global change in the geography of production that's taken place over the past 40 years, really, since it begins in the 1970s and 80s, and it accelerates beginning in the 1990s. So, whereas previously the bulk of industrial production, of manufacturing, was centered in the North, it's now overwhelmingly in the South, some 80%. And, if you look at China, you look at Korea, you look at Brazil, you still see enormous industrial installations. It's not as if factory production has disappeared. It's larger than ever. It's more dispersed. And alongside that, you have, of course, the enormous development of the service economy, however one wants to understand that, which is heavily feminine, which is largely precarious with a lack of secure employment, which is characterized by extremely long hours of work. And so I don't really see that reducing working time has somehow disappeared as an issue. In fact, we're working longer and longer hours, both in traditional forms of manufacturing employment and in the service sector. People work 10, 11, 12, 14, 16-hour days. And so I think I don't understand the difference between the value of work and working time. If work is valuable, that doesn't mean that it should occupy people 24 hours a day. quite the contrary. You know, I think that, for example, if you look at a country like India, where some 95, 96% perhaps of the population is working outside the formal sector, it's understandable. If you look at the history of working class organizing, specifically since the emergence of this industrial capitalism in the middle of the 19th century, people organized where they're brought together in large numbers in similar conditions at a workplace. And so it's normal that in a country like India, you know, with this dispersed system of manufacturing and service provision, that unions should have been formed on the railroads, in the mines, in the public administration. The problem is what about the rest of the population? You know, how do you organize them? How do you find ways for them to effectively express their demands? And how do you bring workers who still have some organized strength to bring that strength in support of this vast majority? I think that's the challenge.
Thank you, Peter. I know that there are quite a few people that want to comment also on this point. I think, Nico, you wanted to say something on this one. But just a quick point that one doesn't have to be against the other. We should be fighting both for less working hours, but also for meaningful work. And that is connected to the demands for control over the labor process. That workers can have over the pace of production and also, I think, connected to our work on environment, what kind of jobs should still be existing. We don't have some of the jobs, as Graeber rightly put it, are basically bullshit jobs that shouldn't, are denigrating jobs or jobs that have no value to the society. So that is a conversation we should be having, definitely also in the labor movement, to not just reduce the debate just to have any sort of job, but actually also about the value of jobs to the society. Nico, would you hold on since Comrade Wisdom hasn't spoken yet, but we can come back to the conversation. Wisdom, yes, please. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. I like the way the conversation is flowing. I guess you are getting me. Thank you very much. Should I conclude to say the revolution or evolution of unionism is as a result of industrialization? Should I personally conclude that according to the way the conversation is flowing? Peter?
Well, historically, I think that's the case. I mean, working people have always protested, working people in the largest sense. But they formed durable trade union organizations when capitalism started assembling large numbers of workers in a common workspace. But that doesn't mean that trade union forms of organization, that is collective organizations of working people, are confined are confined to industrial employment. I mean, we know that the whole other categories of workers have organized in unions to pursue their demands. But historically, yeah, that's where trade unionism comes from.
Thank you. Nico, do you want to jump in if there is no other question?
Yeah, just very, very shortly, because this debate that was touched by Alejandra in the 8 hours shows part of the challenges of intersectionality in my perspective. And I was reading this very interesting book by Helen Hespek and Nick Srinek. You might know about that. I mean, it was translated into Spanish, and Nick came to Argentina recently, because he basically said that this idea of 8 hours essentially was based on the basis that the 8 hours for free time meant that women will be doing what men don't do at the domestic sphere. And also the type of jobs that were conducted were organized along the lines of race and gender. So I think it's interesting to think the future of work challenging this concept or this idea of the 8 hours. And there's much of the debate on how to use the time, or how we think to use the time in the future, are at least introduced as a form of debate for the next, I mean, for the present. The future is the present, but we are assisting at the transformation of that very same idea, which again, it had a problem inside. All of those who at some point agree on that concept, it was essentially a white men concept. I'm not saying something new, but we need to problematize probably more on that. And this is why I think the debate on intersectionality needs to be deeply addressed. But that depth brings the problem of complexity, and also the problem of banalization, as we call it. When certain slogans on race and gender, but mostly on race, which is pretty much the field I work, is banalized and not seriously dealt in its interaction with class. Sorry for the long and controversial comment, but it's a way of introducing, layers of complexity. And very recommended this debate brought by Srinek and Helen Hester. I placed the quote in the chat, and for those Spanish speakers, the book is in Spanish as well.
Thank you. Peter, I don't know whether you have any comment on that, or we take Gabin's.
No, but just briefly, I think it's indisputable that if you consider the labor movement as something which arose initially in Western Europe and its outliers, the imagination of the movement, its slogans, its symbols, were definitely masculine, and definitely were constructed around the image of a male breadwinner who supported a family. And therefore, the demand for an 8-hour day, which is still very much an urgent demand in my view, because people have a right to a life apart from work, failed to take into account that women workers often perform double employment. So they would have an 8-hour day if you were successful at the factory, and then spend hours and hours and hours of work as caregivers and as the principal support for family life. And so the demand for the 8-hour day, like so many things, in my view, was emancipatory on the one hand. It was actually a matter of biological and social necessity in at a time when people were being worked to death with work days of 12 hours and more, but was also constraining because it failed to take account of all those hours of unpaid labor. And to the extent that the labor movement remained in this hyper-masculinist set of assumptions, the movement was weakened. It failed to mobilize an enormously powerful reserve force constituted by women.
Thanks, Peter. Gavin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, let me convey my disappointment that I was unable to sign up on time due to internet glitches at my end. We know here on the continent of Africa, it is always a challenge having stable connectivity. I am Gavin Raphael. I work with the Solidarity Center as an organizer of trade with the trade unions in West Africa. Most of my primary activities are focused here in Nigeria. I want to thank especially Edira for the facilitation, as well as Peter Rossman, though I missed a larger portion of his earlier presentation. But I'm very curious on some of the materials that will be shared, especially by Rossman, as a way of further reading. I knew that out here in our space, there are challenges about trying to connect the history of the labor movement to the present reality with literature such as The End of History and Last Man by Francis Fukuyama. And these are materials being pushed in the mainstream education, and we equally see the dwindling of materials education such as this. I'm thinking how participants could be well grounded. A person like me, how you can be well grounded in this, in especially reference materials that will enable me and my colleagues engage, especially at debates, especially during social dialogues and issues that borders on the history of trade unions, especially in the context of organizing from the first industrial revolution to probably the fourth and the fifth revolution, which we're experiencing. What strategies workers adopted to overcome and the capitalist tendencies to suppress workers' voices and stuff like that. It is one area that I'm curious about, and I will appreciate if there are further materials in this regard. Thank you very much, Rossman.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gavin. I really hope, especially with your position, that you're going to take the course also with the people that you are working in West Africa. And I want to say something is not to excuse Peter for not having a key reading, but Peter has certainly worked more than 8 hours a day for 2 years for this course. So there was a plan to actually have a key reading also for this one, and I think it's coming. It's just that it's going to take a bit of time, but for sure something that will be added, and that there are so many other videos that we would really I think that's really our main objective, to get the course to as many trade union activists as possible that are struggling to find some inspiration today and look at the labor history and what we can learn. But Peter, I don't know whether you want to say any word to what Gavin, but I wanted to provide a very honest reason for why there is no key reading for your own video lecture.
No, we just didn't get to it.
Yeah, okay, but Fish, do you want to say something? I know.
Yes, since you brought up the issue of gender and the masculine unionism, and then I want to express my anger and emotion facing some big union brothers. So actually, when I watched the video clip from you, Peter, your first line of statement is labor movement has never been confined to collective bargaining. At that time, at that moment, I was like, yes, screaming at the computer screen. I will tell you why. Because me being a union organizer for domestic workers, from time to time, whenever we meet with some big union brothers, they often ask us the first question is, how do you do collective bargaining? So before I was really seriously into it and seriously answer that question and sharing with these union brothers some practices and examples. But then later on, I find that this question is actually a fake question in the way that it's also because of their attitude, how they speak to us when we post some work issue like long hour works, abuses, they still talk all the time, maze and maze and maze altogether stressing us. So I feel later, bit by bit, that is actually a questioning when they ask us, how do you do collective bargaining? It's a question to put us down and to a question to tell us, especially in Asia context, that you are migrants community is not unions, you are not unions, just like that. So so on that, taking that note on the collective bargaining agreement, which is often put forward as a very top priority, and also like a union say, which I'm not against that. But recently I read a book who is from the labor lawyers based on the British context. It was saying that in the 60s and 70s, the collective bargaining framework did not provide. So I just read the line. Sorry, I will start again. So in this book, it says in the 60s and 70s, the limitation of the voluntary model were recognized by governments. Collective bargaining did not provide universal coverage for workers, but was instead clustered in male sectors, such as manufacturing and mining. For example, it was estimated that in the 1967, in the British context, only 50% of the manual workers and 30% of the white-collar workers were trade union members. There were far lower levels of unionization among women workers. This created the familiar democratic danger that well-represented interests of the majority might override the interests of minority groups within the trade union. Worse still, many workers had no union representation at all. So I was thinking how some of the union demand is stemmed from very gender development historically in the labor union movement. Is it really that the case women workers are not enough organized to allow us to build more demands that can be like kind of suitable for us or responding to really the general workers? And of course, I've heard your point about the development of the industrialization that has made up all these situations. So I'd like to hear your comment about the gender side in the labor development. Thank you.
Well, Fish, can you make the question a little more precise?
Yes, sorry for that. So what I read from that book, it says that it was in the history that the male workers are organized. Mm-hmm. And that's why the issues of women workers were not taken up, as well as the marginalized workers. And also that relates to how collective bargaining, which is more confined into a industrialized workforce setting, instead of having it to, for example, for domestic workers, we don't have a corporate. In general, we are one-on-one. Yeah. So in that setting, claiming to fight for collective bargaining in the conventional union setting will not fit us. Is that because of the development of the union that is very much masculine with more majority male workers as members, that makes some of the demands only like collective bargaining?
Well, there are situations where collective bargaining, as it's normally practiced, clearly doesn't work, and domestic workers are, one prime example. So the question is less about collective bargaining because they cannot bargain with their individual employers as individuals. The question is how collectively domestic workers can organize to defend their rights as workers. They clearly are workers. They're not, they're in, I won't say an anomalous situation because there's so many of them, but they're working in an area which is completely outside the field in which collective bargaining has historically applied. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not workers, and that doesn't mean they don't need collective organization. The question is on the one hand, how to do it, and on the other hand, for those workers who are involved in some kind of collective bargaining relationship, really to extend their understanding of the role of the labor movement in defending the working class as a whole. I think that's the question. You cannot identify the working class with those people who are covered by collective bargaining agreements because it's a minority of the world's workforce. It has been a powerful vehicle for advancing workers' demands, and I think a force for social change. It can also, particularly in the absence of a larger commitment, it can also degenerate or ossify or become frozen as a mechanism for defending the particular interests of a particular group of workers to the exclusion of everything that's happening in the societies around them, including what's happening with other kinds of workers. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, that's the situation that we are facing to some unionists, and we don't know how to fight. Of course, we organize all the time. We need their support, but at the same time, they are the ones who do not recognize us at the same time. So yeah, I hope the course can provide me more argument. And of course, we will revenge for those union members who still keep on calling us mace all the time.
Well, I think, I think the problem is larger than the incomprehension of a group of male-dominated unions and their inability to understand the needs of domestic workers. It goes much further. I mean, there are whole sections of the workforce now which are thoroughly feminized and which remain unorganized. And that's a problem not only for those workers, it's a threat to the survival of the labor movement as a whole. If all you're going to have left is these sort of residual pockets of legacy unions, then there is not much of a future for the labor movement as a movement that's fighting for working people in general. And it has all kinds of manifestations. I remember, I don't know when it was exactly, like around the year 2000 maybe, there were a series of strikes and protests by workers at fast food restaurants in Paris, many of whom are of African or Arabic-speaking origin. And so they went on strike at some of the more public, some of the more visible fast food establishments, in fancy parts of Paris. And they said they wanted a union of precarious workers, that their situation was precarious, they had no regular hours, they had no rights. So they wanted to form a union of precarious workers. And they made some fairly loud and fairly visible and fairly effective protests. And I remember representatives from, this highly fractured French trade union movement went down to check the situation out. And some of them shook their heads and said, we don't understand. These people are not really workers, So the problem is general. It's mixed with gendering and racializing, but it's also part of a larger incomprehension of the labor movement as a vehicle for struggle for the whole world of work. And I think if there's any lesson to this chapter, that is certainly one of them.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I don't know if there is any burning question. Otherwise, we are past the time. If there is no other question, I would like to, of course, thank Peter very much for the time and for the great conversation. He says we are in full solidarity with all the comrades in Peru about the terrible situation of workers there. And you have all, of course, our solidarity. Yeah, and I think we can wrap it up, the first workshop. It's been a great conversation. Thanks a lot for the amazing questions, everyone. We are meeting on Monday for the next workshop.